Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Rural Center Manager of Policy and Government Affairs, Tiffany Gladney.
Good afternoon. Can you guys hear me? Welcome back to the Rural Day Convocation. I hope you enjoyed your lunch and are ready to get back to action. We have worked to make Rural Day an event where you can learn all about the biggest issues facing rural North Carolina. But our ultimate goal is for you to be prepared to have conversations with state leaders about how to solve these challenges. Elected officials are charged with the awesome responsibility of working to make their districts, counties, and state a little better than they found them. But we as citizens also have a responsibility, and that is to make sure our elected officials know the challenges we face as well as the triumphs we celebrate, which is why it is so important to know your representatives and to have meaningful interactions with them. That is why we at the Rural Center strive to create new, productive ways for citizens to engage with their elected officials. If we can break down the walls between leader and citizen, Republican and Democrat, rural and urban, we can start to have those honest conversations, and they will lead to real solutions. It is in that spirit that we have crafted this afternoon's session to afford you the rare opportunity to hear an unscripted conversation with our state's top legislative leaders, both Senate and House, Democrat and Republican. Over the next hour, you will hear our leaders' visions for rural economic development, and you'll get the inside scoop on what it's really like to work at the General Assembly. And hopefully, you'll get a better sense of how we are all working together to bridge the divides for a better North Carolina. Okay, y'all, I'm really excited to introduce this session's facilitators. They are truly leading the charge to transition political discourse into productive policies. John Hood, the president of the John William Pope Foundation, has been writing on North Carolina politics for more than 30 years. Nell Hotchkiss, North Carolina Rural Center board member and senior vice president for the North Carolina Electric Cooperatives, has been working on behalf of rural communities and co-ops for over 25 years. Both serve on the board of the Institute for Political Leadership, an organization that trains North Carolinians from across the spectrum on running for office, managing campaigns, and serving the public with integrity. We can imagine no two better hosts for an afternoon in conversation with our legislative leaders. So please join me in welcoming John and Nell.
Well, good afternoon. We're delighted to be with you as we have some fascinating, we hope, conversations with our legislative leaders. Our task is to explore some issues with, of course, a particular focus on rural North Carolina, but also issues that have statewide import, and to take at least a few minutes to try to take you behind the scenes of what's happening and what it's like in the General Assembly, and also to see what kinds of conversations, productive conversations we hope, are happening across partisan and regional and other kinds of lines in our North Carolina General Assembly. So that's our task for this afternoon. And we're going to introduce our panelists for this first session. These are two of our Republican leaders in the North Carolina General Assembly. And I have the privilege of introducing Phil Berger. Senator Berger grew up in Danville, Virginia, in a working class family that taught him the value of hard work. After school, he married his high school sweetheart, Pat. He worked in a local factory and then as a produce manager of a grocery store, while raising two young kids and attending college. He became the first in his family to graduate from which is now Everett University. Still raising a young family and working long hours to make ends meet, Phil attended law school at Wake Forest University and graduated early. He practiced law in Charlotte and Raleigh before settling in Eden, where he still lives with Pat and runs the Berger Law Firm. Phil and Pat have 3 kids, Phil Jr., Kevin, and Ashley, and 4 grandkids. Phil was first elected to the state Senate in the year 2000. His colleagues elected him minority leader in 2004 and President Pro Tem of the North Carolina Senate in 2010 after Republicans won their majority in that chamber for the first time since the 19th century. The first Republican leader of the North Carolina Senate then in more than 100 years, Senator Berger has delivered common sense and conservative reforms to state government. Please welcome Senator Phil Berger.
And I have the pleasure of introducing Representative Brenden Jones, who is a Columbus County native, and he's a graduate of Waccamaw Academy in Whiteville. He has been married to his high school sweetheart, Angela, for over 20 years. They live in Tabor City with their 2 daughters, and Representative Jones has been a small business owner and operator in Tabor City for over 15 years. In addition to his role with the North Carolina General Assembly, Representative Jones is a member of the National Federation of Independent Businesses, and which is the nation's leading small business advocate. Representative Jones also serves in Tabor City for the Committee of 100, and as many of those members of the Columbus County Jobs Foundation and the Southeastern Community College Board of Trustees. He's also an active member in his church, Tabor City Baptist Church, where he serves as deacon. Representative Jones is a past member of the Columbus County Board of Elections and served as its board's chairman. Representative Jones was appointed to the Rule Center Board by Lieutenant Governor Dan Forrest, where he served on the transition team after the center's reorganization. In his second term, Representative Jones serves as the Deputy Majority Leader, Chair of Appropriations, Information Technology Committee, and is the ex officio member of all House standing committees. Please help me welcome Representative Jones. Well, let's go ahead and get started. We really appreciate you being here with us today. Senator Berger, I'll go ahead and start with you. If you can give me an overview of your major goals as Senate leader during this 2019 session.
Sure. I would say the major goal is to be cognizant of what we've seen happen in North Carolina from a legislative standpoint over the past 8 years, and to try to stay the course, that course being balanced budgets, budgets that grow based on the growth in the state and inflation, that recognizes and tries to continue our effort to lower the cost of government, particularly that cost of government on the private sector, because the private sector is where ultimately the jobs and the prosperity that we are now experiencing in a large part of the state. Many of the rural areas are not quite participating in that at this time, but stay the course, make sure that we have a budget that's balanced and sustainable.
Okay. Representative Jones, is there specific goals that the House leadership has outlined for 2019?
Well, piggybacking on what the senator said, I mean, we want to make sure we have a balanced budget, that we're very cognizant of our state employees to make sure they're taken care of. And just an overall climate of North Carolina, keep that same momentum that we've experienced over the last few years under the senator's leadership as well as Speaker Moore.
Okay.
Well, let's zero in on a couple of issues that I'm certain our audience is interested in and has heard a little bit about today already. And one of them is health care, both access to and the affordability of health care, particularly in our rural areas. Do y'all see that as a priority for 2019? And if so, what kinds of initiatives or programs do you think would help?
Well, it's John, it's a huge priority. It's one of the things that when you talk to constituents, they are very concerned about. Many people are concerned about the health coverage that they currently have and whether or not that coverage is going to continue, about the cost of that coverage. There's also some real concerns about what's happening to our hospitals, particularly the rural hospitals, in terms of whether or not they continue to operate on a sustainable business model. We have, at least in the Senate, and I know the House has got some things that they're working on as well, and ultimately we'll have to find some way to work together on that. But we've passed a measure that helps small businesses in terms of their ability to provide health care coverage for their employees. Small businesses and sole proprietorships will be able to access large group plans by coordinating and working with one another. They can't do that presently, or had not been able to do that until a recent rule revision by the Trump administration. So we've worked on that. We also today introduced a bill that Senator Krovic and Senator Bishop introduced a bill that would help improve the access to care by making modifications to our certificate of need laws, but also to deal with a backlog that we currently have on folks being eligible for certain Medicaid services, particularly our most severely disabled folks. So those measures, but one of the real things that we need to tackle is the problem with the mix of payers that many of our healthcare providers have, and in those areas where the mix is primarily Medicaid and Medicare, what you have is a real difficult situation from an economic standpoint for those providers to continue to be able to stay in business. So by providing an ability of the private sector, small businesses particularly, to provide insurance coverage for their employees, I think that has the potential of helping that payer mix.
Representative Jones, there are some, get some water, yeah. There are some proposals I also understand in the House side on healthcare access, competition in medical services, and the general issue of cost. How about telling us some of those?
Well, one of the things that we've looked at on the House side is the SAFE Act, which I'm a co-sponsor of. And that will be utilizing our nurses in places where we don't have physicians all the time. My area, which is one of the most rural areas in the state, Columbus County, my hometown is a great example where we had 3 physicians in the town, now we have none. So utilizing our nurses and our PAs is going to be huge for rural North Carolina to get access to health care without having to travel to the bigger cities. As the Senator said, our rural hospitals, we're having to make sure and be very diligent on what we're doing and what we're working on to make sure that those facilities do not get left behind. So we are working on those same items.
Okay. Well, a natural progression in this is the access to health care and healthcare professionals. Certainly, rural broadband access is part of that conversation, I think, for efficiencies and to be able to do that well. Not every community can have specialists, and so there are opportunities through telemedicine perhaps to move that forward. If you can give us your views on how, and maybe different proposals that are out there specifically, but your view on deployment for rural broadband and next steps, and really where House leadership is looking to go moving forward with multiple parties.
Well, and that's exactly what we're doing. We're looking across the whole spectrum. We're talking to our co-ops. We're talking to the phone companies. We're just talking to anyone that has access. Municipalities, giving them the freedom to be able to develop on a local level to bring those kind of things. I come from an area that's poorly served by broadband. I mean, my children, we have to drive sometimes uptown to catch a signal for them to do their homework. So with our medicine, our telemed, it's going to be huge that we make sure that we get those items, and we are working closely every day with those partners to be sure that we can get broadband to every dirt road in North Carolina as soon as possible.
Okay. Senator?
So access to broadband is one of the big issues, particularly in the rural areas. It's something I hear about a lot. My district is one that is comprised of all or part of 4 rural counties, and there are pockets within those counties where there is not access to broadband. I have likened it to what happened in the 1930s when the question was, what do we do about electrification in rural areas? And I think one of the solutions that was developed back then actually may be a partial solution to our broadband issue now. Senator Brown has introduced a bill that would allow our electric co-ops and our telephone co-ops to work together in trying to move into getting broadband access to our more rural areas. I think that's a good step. We also last year passed something called the GREAT Act, which is a funding mechanism for grants to broadband providers to encourage them to move out into more rural areas that are underserved or not served at all.
Senator, you mentioned a few minutes ago that we've seen economic growth and job creation in North Carolina, but of course it hasn't been equally distributed across the state. Rural areas, some rural areas at least, are struggling to keep up with the pace that's happening elsewhere. And a lot of the interest is in business creation, small business, fostering new businesses. Do you have any sense of the legislature's interest or actions regarding business development, particularly in rural areas?
So one of the things that we've tried to do, John, is allow the private sector and our capitalist economy to work, and part of that is making sure our tax rates are as low as possible, and the regulatory climate is favorable for activity in the private sector. So we've done a lot in that regard over the past 8 years. We've gone from 44th worst in the country as far as business tax climate to 12th best in the country, and I think there are some things that we still need to do in that area. We've also passed major regulatory reform measures over the past several years that have helped cut through red tape and make it easier. Now, that's something that has applied across the entirety of the state of North Carolina. It's helped the urban areas as well as, in some instances, the rural areas. What we are dealing with in many respects as far as our rural economy is a national phenomenon where young people, if they grow up in a rural area, the ones that go off to school oftentimes don't come back. I've experienced that myself in my family. My youngest child, once she finished with school and law school, she decided she wanted to live in the Raleigh area. So, and I'm sure there are a lot of folks here that have had the same experience. It's a challenge because we want to do as much as possible to encourage businesses to either locate or to develop in the rural areas, but it, in some instances, is not the government's responsibility to put too heavy a thumb on that action. And so lowering taxes, dealing with regulatory climate. We've also reformed significantly the JDIG program and some of the economic development incentive efforts that are out there to try to be more cognizant of what has been for a long period of time a real imbalance in those programs in terms of where those funds or where those incentives have gone. The vast majority of those incentives end up in 3 places, and that's Wake County, Durham County, and Mecklenburg County. And that's where we're seeing a lot of the growth. As you can imagine, there's some resistance to trying to alter that mix as well.
I'm shocked to learn that. Representative, does the House see this issue of small business and business development the same way, or you've got some different priorities?
Well, absolutely, the Senator's correct. We have to be more creative. Speaking to my local leaders, I've been letting them look outside the box with me. And what I mean by that is we're not necessarily in a small community going to be brick and mortar communities anymore. My hometown, which has dwindled, our largest employer is the state of North Carolina with a prison. We've lost almost every brick and mortar business. But after a long conversation with a gentleman out of Mecklenburg County who had a call center for a computer system in India, with our incentives, cutting our regulatory reforms, and things we've done with our taxes, he saw the need and what we were trying to do locally, that he has moved that call center into Columbus County. So if we get a little creative on our local levels, meet with your legislators and talk about this, there's ways that we can broaden our thinking for our rural areas and not necessarily look at it as a brick and mortar, but there are opportunities out there that we can take advantage of, and I highly suggest that everyone goes back and talk to your local leaders from your rural areas.
Actually, there's one other thing that I'd like to bring up. We had an effort in the past to look at the mix of how sales tax revenue is distributed in North Carolina. When I first moved to Rockingham County 35 plus years ago, I could pretty much within Rockingham County buy anything that I need, whether we were buying washing machines and refrigerators, that sort of thing, or whether I was going to buy a suit. Now, for the most part, unless I want to shop at either Walmart or Lowe's, there's really not a whole lot in the county. And I would say in a lot of rural areas, you're seeing the same thing. And so a lot of money that is either made or is located in rural communities ends up in our more urban areas and is kept there through sales taxes. And so we have looked at trying to address the distribution of the sales tax so that it is distributed more on a per capita basis, so that the money goes to where the people are, because the money is coming from where the people are, as opposed to the money going where the sales takes place. And we have met with significant resistance that I think is going to continue, because as a practical matter, as the state continues to urbanize, the votes in the General Assembly are more and more in those more urban areas, and our ability to address that imbalance is going to be more and more difficult.
You have a whole room full of rural folks here, and we've talked about some very specific strategies for economic development and health and broadband. With your thoughts and strategic philosophy, is there a particular game changer that we haven't mentioned this afternoon that you believe you'd love for these folks and local rural leaders to think through and work with you on moving forward, that perhaps hasn't been addressed, or perhaps maybe isn't even a legislative initiative, but something that rural citizens and rural leaders need to be talking about? Senator?
I should have saved my sales tax comment for that, because I do think that is something that, at least for local governments in the more rural areas, will result in a fairly substantial increase in revenue, so that they have the ability to hopefully further fund their schools. One of the problems we have with many of our schools in rural areas is their ability to attract and keep teachers is somewhat limited, because they don't pay the supplements that the more urban systems pay. And so something that addresses that, I think, would be one thing that could make a big difference.
Yeah. Representative?
I agree with the senator. Coming from an area that I think was receiving maybe about 80 cents on every dollar that had been spent, is getting more like $1.09. So that incentive certainly helps our area with everything the senator said, especially with our teachers. Supplements are huge, so that helps boost our folks and helps with the retention of our folks.
Okay.
So our public narrative right now is conflict. And there is conflict, but I think that lots of North Carolinians would be surprised at how much cooperation there is between the two legislative chambers and between the two major political parties in the General Assembly and elsewhere. And it might be helpful for our audience to just talk a little bit about that, about perhaps a particular example, either a recent example or some initiative you think coming up that illustrates this idea of working across our political differences to solve our common problems.
John, I can talk about process probably more fully than anything else, but from a process standpoint, I'll start out with between the House and the Senate. On a regular basis, our appropriations members meet, House and Senate. They've been meeting since we started the session late January, early February, and they have been meeting 2 and 3 times a week to talk about what needs to be in the budget, what's in the current fiscal year's spending plan. So there's a good bit of discussion as far as that's concerned amongst members. And that's bipartisan, because it's not just the Republican members of the House and the Republican members of the Senate that are in those meetings. Beyond that, the Speaker and I have a weekly meeting that we have to talk about what's going on in each chamber and trying to see if there are things that we are either able to coordinate on or address those things that we're at cross purposes about. So we work on that. The governor, the speaker, and I have had several breakfast meetings where we sit down and sort of the same thing, things we can work together on, things that we're at cross purposes on. What I will say is that I spoke with the Press Association last week, and one of the things that I tried to emphasize for them is that when I was growing up, I kept hearing people talk about how Republicans, Democrats, there's really no difference between the two parties. Now, the folks who were Republicans didn't think so, and the folks who were Democrats didn't think so, but a lot of people felt like, why should I vote? There's really not that much difference. But I would say that now, from a philosophical standpoint, there are great differences between the approach that Republicans would take on issues of public policy and Democrats would take on issues of public policy. And I think that sometimes makes it more difficult to find common ground on particular issues. Not that it doesn't exist, but I do think it makes it more difficult. I think one thing you can look at is the governor's proposed budget and how that compares with budgets that have been adopted over the past 8 years by Republican-controlled General Assemblies. You can also look at the governor's proposed budget in terms of just in the amount of money that the governor would propose to spend and the amount of money that the House and the Senate have agreed are going to be the top line numbers on the House budget. So those are differences that I'm not saying can't be bridged, but they do represent, I believe, a clear example of the real differences that exist. And they're they are sincerely held differences by both parties, and it just makes it more difficult to try to find that common ground.
Representative, from the House perspective, how challenging is this? And what are some recent examples where there was some cooperation across the aisle?
Well, sometimes it's not a Democrat-Republican thing, it's a rural-urban thing. Mm-hmm. And you have to go to your other rural legislators who are Democrats. And you just have to bond with them to go to the guys that are in the urban areas. And you have to state your case. One thing I found very helpful when I first got here was I go to my Senate counterpart daily. He and I talk. And I go to the members of the Senate constantly so that we've got an idea of what they're thinking, what we're thinking, and we can find that compromise early on so we can get the bills moved across that are important. But as far as the Republican, Democrat, there are some divisiveness there, but with the urban-rural deal, it's really important for us to sit with those counterparts, talk it out, and a lot of times we can find medians there that we both agree on. As the senator said, they're passionate about what they believe, we're passionate about what we believe, and a lot of times we can come to that common ground.
And John, probably the best example that actually impacts rural North Carolina has been the hurricane recovery effort. We were able to work with the governor, with the governor's administration, to come up with a package that I think, in all fairness, is probably the most robust response at the state level to a natural disaster that we've seen in North Carolina. And I've heard people talk about how Florence was probably the worst hurricane we have seen, and yet the legislature working with the governor, and I would say, my recollection is the bills that passed in the legislature were passed unanimously and signed by the governor. So Republicans, Democrats worked together. We had a common goal, and we were able to find a common method to achieve that goal. We've done some other things that represent, I think, the ability to bridge the divide. A lot of the economic development work that we've done has been very much bipartisan. We have worked with the executive branch to modify some of the incentive programs that are out there. And so I don't mean to say that, you know, the Republicans are always going to be over here and the Democrats here and nobody's going to meet here, but there are examples of that, a number of them. I'd say 90% of the legislation that is taken up in the General Assembly passes with unanimous or near unanimous votes. It's just that there are some very big issues that there are very real differences.
Any parting comments that you want to provide to our audience, Representative Jones?
Well, for my rural folks out there, just like myself, there's things that we can do. Keep working with your local municipalities as much as you can. Let's look outside the box, as I've said before. Sometimes it's not going to be the brick and mortar answer that we were looking for. There's things, there's incentives. You know, get with us. Let us help walk you through those things, and there's hope and future for our rural areas. North Carolina's strong, and we're growing by bounds every day, and there's no reason that our rural areas can't join that growth.
Senator?
And I'll pick up with that. There are more people working today in North Carolina than at any time in our history. Things are good overall as far as the state is concerned. There are pockets where there are real problems, and part of our job, I think, is to recognize those problems and, to the extent that it's appropriate, for government to get involved for us to try to find solutions.
What's the best way for our large 600-plus person group of folks to interact and engage with you on these issues? What's the best way to do that?
The best way is if you are from Caswell, Rockingham, Stokes, or Surrey counties, contact me directly. If you are in another county, figure out who your House member is, who your Senate member is, develop a relationship with that person, and make sure that they know who you are and what you're concerned about. Great.
Can we all give a round of applause to both of our legislators? For being with us today. This is a busy time for session, and we appreciate you taking some time to pop over here to the Convention Center and share your thoughts with us today. Thank you.
Thank you for having us.